All right, it looks we are at time, so let's go ahead and get started. My name is Chinda and I'm with NACB and the Consultants Training Institute. Before we get started with the round of Valuation World today, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. First, to obtain CP credit, if you have a subscription to ABW, you'll receive, please respond to all the poll questions that pop up on your screen during today's webcast. CP certificates will be available within 7 to 10 business days after the webcast. If you have any questions during today's webinar, please use the Q&A feature as those will be directed to the presenters. If you have any questions about NACB or any technical questions, please feel free to reach out to me through the chat and I'll be more than happy to respond to that. With ABW, we try to stay abreast with all the upcoming trends in the industry. There is links in your material to other resources that are available, just because we can't cover all the topics within the 2-hour window each month. And with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Mel and Alina, who, as you can see, are our editors for the show, and they'll get us started for today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chinda. Welcome, everyone. Happy New Year to everyone. It's so good to have you here. We've got our first program for the year. It's going to be a good one. Well, they all are, but I'm biased. So we're going to start off our sessions with a good friend and one of the I don't know, my favorites, Michael Gregory, talking about industry headlines, kind of a body of knowledge brief. Then we'll move into industry and expert insights with Stephen White and Kerrie Merrifield. And another one of the favorites will be followed up by our judges panel with Alan Zipp and the honorable judges. We then talk about case law with Michael Mulder. And then we'll finish up with building a practice and brand and growing and building a brand with Janae Castell talking with Stephen Dotterer. But let's get to the first one, which is with Michael Gregory. And Michael, you should know him if you've been on any AVW, you know him. If you haven't, then you're in for a treat. Michael, he goes in and he takes a lot of the industry headlines, gives us a summary, and tells us where to go deeper on some of these things. He's been in business valuations for many, many years, first with the IRS and now outside, mediator, speaker, author, all the stuff. He's really good at what he does, and he's always a crowd favorite. So, Michael, so good to have you here, my friend. Happy New Year.
Well, that's a very embellishing introduction, but thank you very much, Mel. My pleasure to be here today. We start off with the comments in terms of what's going on with the core body of knowledge, where I take a look at a number of sources each month and take about 10 minutes or so and share with you information related to those different articles. The first one is, do ethics rules apply to biased appraisers by Alan Zipp? And then Business Valuation Resources extends research of a groundbreaking research tool. And I'll go over that with you a little bit. And then Financial Expert Guide for Family Law Judges and Attorneys. There's a new book that's out, and I wanted to share that book with you. Hitchner warns of the perils of plagiarism. That's to just warn us to be very careful. If you take things from other reports or you're taking things from other people, you could get in trouble for doing that. So he gives us some tips on what to do. Regulations governing practice before the IRS. This is a very big deal. It's been released to all the major appraisal organizations too. And they're determining what they want to do in terms of a response. And it's something that says that appraisers can now be referred through Circular 230, so you could lose your ability to practice before the IRS. So I'll go over that a little bit, but I'm also going to give you a link as to where you can click to provide your own comments on this by February 24th. And I'll bring this up next month as well. And the court knocks out AI-assisted damages analysis, the first case that we're aware of, where the court took a look at somebody using AI in their analysis. We'll point out what they did that the court thought was wrong and what you might want to think about so that you don't do that if you're using any AI analysis. So the objectives of today: consider ethics and bias in what you do, assess the new artificial intelligence business valuation research tool in a closed system. This is important, that closed system, and I'll talk about that. Recognize new expert witness guide for family law. Proceed with plagiarism at your own peril. He suggests footnotes. We'll get to that. Call to action, comment on appraisers before the IRS, and recognize why the court knocked out the AI-assisted valuation report. So in the first category, do ethics rules apply to biased appraisers? The bottom line on this is yes, they do. NACFA standards are principle-based and provide general and ethical standards. There isn't an ethics section per se, but we do have an ethics board, and we do have standards that say what we need to make sure we're doing in terms of our principles. USPAP and AICPA each have their own separate ethics section. It's not required, but knowing that, we are bound by the same type of things, and there's a document that NACFA has put together that compares USPAP and AICPA and NACFA standards. We all need to be objective. We're all supposed to be unbiased. We should say we're unbiased in our report. We should say we're operating with integrity. And even when a client has a specific interest, we should be operating independently regardless of who's paying us. And yes, as I indicated, ethics rules apply to all appraisers. BVR extends a research tool. So this is a groundbreaking research tool. It's called RADA, Research and Data Analysis. Now, if you have a closed system, which is what they've done, they said they've taken those 4 different elements that are there: deal stats, economic outlook, control premium study, and biz comps, and they've put them into their own AI arena. When you do that, you're not going to have things come from outside of that group. That's a closed system. And you can research different things within that. And they have an example in this article that talks about, I want to know what medium and average minority discounts are on equity in some of the recent quarters. So it shows you what they are, and it shows some trends and can give you some graphs, which can be very helpful to you. But then they have a caution in here that when you agree to do this, you're also agreeing that you will not share the results of this tool on any other AI tool. So you can't upload this to ChatGPT, for example, or any other equivalent organization. You're agreeing to that in terms of the terms of use. And if you did that, you'd be susceptible to be in trouble with the BV folks, BV Resources folks. So you wouldn't want to do that. Financial Expert Guide for Family Law Judges and Attorneys. This is a new book by Tetlock, Senior, and Yiannopoulos. I've got a copy of the book. I've looked at it. It's a 400-page guide. It's, again, for family law judges and attorneys. It has information on there that judges and attorneys, one, need to know and want to know. It has a chronology of more recent family cases. It tackles important issues that show up in family law. And it starts off with, these are just different example chapters on standards of value, the premise of value, valuation approaches and methods, professional goodwill versus personal goodwill, reasonable comp, financial forensics, hidden assets, and more. And then I thought, even this is kind of fun from my perspective. I have a different definition of fun, but I think it's kind of fun. They have practical checklists in some of these different areas, and they have some forms to fill in, some questionnaires on what you would want to ask. So if you were a law judge or an attorney, you'd say, oh, I find this to be helpful, and I wonder about this, and I wonder about that. So if your report covered these things, you'd be fine. If your report didn't cover these things, that may be something that somebody else, a judge or an attorney, might want to ask you, or you want to make sure the attorney knows what you've done on those things. Hitchner warns of the perils of plagiarism. You may be plagiarizing and not even knowing that you've done it. You have things that are in your reports that you've used for years. On the other hand, you may be taking something from another report or somebody else's work. And the caution here from Hitchner is be careful, because if you ever end up in court on something, they're going to check your report for plagiarism. And today, artificial intelligence tools and internet content is an open door to plagiarism, because you're thinking you may be getting some original research, and at the beginning, like now, for example, when you research something in Google, it'll say AI has come up with this. So artificial intelligence is giving you an answer, which may or may not be right, but that may be an answer. You want to maybe go down a little bit further to find out actual sources. But whether it's inadvertent or not, you're still on the hook for what you have in your report. So if testifying, you could be caught. If you're testifying, you may want to have somebody, if you haven't, have somebody else look at your report to see if you have anything in there that has been plagiarized. And maybe he suggests, is in the bottom of this group, put a footnote to it so that you say, I got it from that given source. And things that you can look for in somebody else's report is you want to say, do I see that there's a change in the tone? I've written some things, and I've gone in and what I've written, and I've gone in and said, I'm going to use Grammarly. That's another one of the sources to improve my grammar. And my wife says, this does not sound like you. And I said, yeah, I ran it through this other AI AI source. And then it sounds better. It's cleaning up things. It's making things more concise. I tend to be a little verbose. But then she could actually spot that and say, I can tell that you did not write this. And if you want to go to a source, you can go to plagiarism.com. I'm going to caution you how to spell plagiarism. That's how you spell it. I misspelled it, so I went to a different source. You don't want to go to the different source, but that's how you spell plagiarism. I now know that for my own correction. And in the group that took the Hitchner webinar and responded to it, half of his audience said they have found BV reports with plagiarism in it. So this is a common issue in our industry. You want to watch that for yourself and also be aware of that relative to someone else's. You may want to have that checked for plagiarism on their part. Then regulations governing practice before the IRS. This is actually a big deal. The call to action came out one day after Christmas. That's not a time when the IRS releases things that the public is being informed. They usually release things between Christmas and New Year's that they're hoping people really won't notice that. Well, it came out December 26th, and it says comments can be made through February 24th. And what are the concerns? It says if you want to practice before the IRS, and you're an appraiser, it's the first time they've done this in that Circular 230, then you need to meet these criteria. And who can refer you? Anybody. So if somebody doesn't like you, they can refer you to the director of practice. And they said they're going to use IVS standards and they're going to use USPAP. And I'm concerned about who's going to determine whether you meet USPAP or not. And there are folks at the IRS who sometimes have a very aggressive view. That's a distinct minority, but there are some folks there that take a very aggressive view. That I was involved with a case with an appraiser where he made a mistake in the report. He had a number earlier in the report. He had a number later in the report. The number later in the report was not correct. When it was brought up on audit, he goes, oh, that's a mistake. You notice I didn't use that number. And a USPAP instructor who was a senior appraiser at the IRS wanted to take this guy up on fraud. And I thought, there's no way. And eventually there was no way. But I'm just commenting who's going to enforce that and how they're going to enforce it. Do you have any concerns about that? And if you do, you might want to include your comments. And I know the major appraisal organizations are all looking at this. They're going to decide what they want to do going forward. But my major concern is potential abuse by the IRS more than I'm concerned about the appraisers who are doing poor work. Because the appraisers who have been doing poor work, the IRS has been putting penalties on those. And on this Circular 230, you don't have to have a penalty to be referred. Anybody can refer anyone on any appraisal for any reason. The court knocks out AI-assisted damages and analysis. And in this case, this is the first court that I'm aware of that's addressed AI. And there's the citation to that particular case, and I've got a link in the references to that case. But they used an AI tool to cross-check their calculations. And then when it came up to say, okay, we want to take a look at what you did and how you got there and the operation of the actual mechanics. And when the court looked at this and said, I just want to get the same kind of results you did once we run this tool. And they said, well, the tool's continually changing. So, and there isn't a way like in Google that you can go back and say, well, what was AI on this topic as of a given date? In Google, you can look up Google and look at something from a back date of what was available at that time. In this situation on AI, you can't do that. So the court said, we can't figure out how you got that. And we try to run it now and we don't get there. And so we're concerned about two things, consistency and reliability. If you don't have consistency and reliability, then we're not going to accept that in our court. So that's something for you to think about. If you're using AI for computations or something, you could check yours. That's just in your work papers, but you want to make sure what you have is your own work. Here are the sources. Here's BVR's research and data analysis tool. Here's Financial Expert Guide for Family Law Judges and Attorneys if you wanted to subscribe to that. Here's where you can check out other people's work or your own in terms of plagiarism. This is the matter of that court case on AI. It's Weber, New York court on AI being thrown out on valuation case. And if you want to comment on these regulations governing practice before the IRS, this is the source where you can provide your own comments. They mention appraiser in Circular 230 on this draft in over 100 different instances. So I would encourage you, if you practice before the IRS, you might want to look at this, you might want to think about this, you might want to think what your concerns are. And my biggest concerns are anybody can refer you, and anybody at the IRS can make the decisions on whether you've met USPAP or IVS standards. And are there any concerns in using IVS standards versus other standards? These are the different sources I look at in the course of the past year. The ones that are in bold are the ones that I applied specifically for our session here today. And that's just as a reference. This is who I am. That's my contact information. And that's my email. And that's my initial comment for today. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move into a summary of, when there's a pop-up question, go ahead and answer that. There is a body of knowledge that I put together every month like this, as was indicated by Mel here earlier. And what I've done, I just have to click back in here. There we go. And what I've done is I've looked at my entire year and I said, I'm going to summarize for you. I was involved with 3 interviews, 1 presentation. I've given you 72 articles in the course of 2024. There are 51 references in the links to help you. And what I've done is I've looked at each month, January through December of last year. And I said, I'm going to pull out just 2 of those articles, show you the headline of that. And I thought of the 6 that I typically have 6, it could be 5, could be 7, could be 8, but typically I have 6 articles per month. And I pulled out 2 of those to say, here's some key things that I thought you might want to reference for yourself. And I provide all the reference links, and I'm just going to skip through those when I get there, but you've got all the reference links in there as well. So let's take a look at January. Non-certified occasional valuer is not qualified appraiser per U.S. tax court. The tax court came through and said, you need to be doing appraisal work regularly. They don't define regularly, but if you do 1 of these a year, it's probably not going to make it. If you do a half dozen of these a year, that could be considered regularly. I don't know. It sounds reasonable to me. And then update on guidance regarding the company-specific risk premium. This was a particular article that talked about risk premium and things you might want to know and address for yours. AI studies top several McKinsey lists for 2023. The McKinsey group provides articles each year where they take a look at AI from several different perspectives. And I'm sure they're going to come out here in about February this year again. And they provided good information to take a look at how it might be used from different perspectives. Dotterer is someone that I follow. I would encourage you to follow Dotterer as well. He posted his first quarter data update for 2024 back in January of 2024, and he's probably about to do one of those again. And I find Dotterer to be a very helpful source on taking a look at all sorts of data. He has his own slant. He looks at this as an academic. He looks at this from the standpoint of, I'll say, financial perspectives, rather than I'm a fair market value guy, so we are in a little bit different world. But he provides very good insight. I have a lot of respect for Dr. Dotterer. The valuation prophecy, considering the post-valuation data information. At what point can you take information that may be after the date of valuation? What was known or knowable as of the date of valuation? And the courts have made some different commentaries on this, was saying, well, the draft information of what would have been known in June wasn't actually published until the 3rd week of July, and the valuation date was July 1. Can you use that data? There's a court case that says in U.S. tax court, yeah, you can use that data as if you knew it back on June 30th. Well, that's not exactly known or knowable. It's not finalized, but the drafts were available. So there are things to consider on timing of post-valuation dates. Review of surveys on cost of capital, sources and inputs. This was looking at several different sources that people used. Dotterer was one, Pepperdine is one, using different sources of value source, et cetera. Taking a look at different sources of data and what some of the pros and cons are associated with those. Analytics on the structure of pricing preferred stock, preferred shares. I don't typically get involved with valuing preferred shares, so it's not something that's big on my radar. But if you're involved with valuing preferred shares, this talked about things that you need to think about and address if you're going to be involved with valuing preferred shares. Jim Hitchner has a document that comes out every month. I subscribe to that. And then he has an annual review of kind of this is what you really need to know. If you want to know what are the things that are the most important things for you to know right now, these are the most important things in the industry. So I look forward to what he writes in that commentary. I look forward to what he's going to bring up here in the next couple of months. I'm sorry, the top line of this didn't come through very well, but it's court-appointed neutrals, special masters. This was an interview we had with Merrill Hirsch. He's the executive director of Academy Courts Appointed Neutrals. And he ran through what it's like to be an appointed neutral by the court. And he also ran through what mediation is and how we could be mediators and help mediate between different business valuers. So I appreciated his commentary that he shared with us on that given day. I'm just reminding you of this. This is an expert who's an expert in conflict resolution and mediation. Another one of our commentaries, this is from Jim Turner. He was been on for the last 2 years, 2023 and 2024. And in this case, he was talking about peer comps and how you can use peer comps to assist you in your valuations when you've got smaller entities. And I just pulled some of the elements out of that article when I was preparing for this commentary with you. That has over 15,000 transactions. It looks at a 25-year period from 1998 through 2023. And it provides comprehensive guidance on what might be reasonable for price over EBITDA, price over seller's discretionary earnings, price over revenue. And it talks about how to use it and what you need to do. It only allows for a maximum loan of $5 million if you're going with the Small Business Administration. It has an upper limit on EBITDA of about 10 million, and an upper limit on revenue of about 100,000. So just some things to think about in terms of that particular source. And I appreciate him sharing that with us. And he uses this all the time, so he's an expert in that area. And I'm sure he'd be open to discuss any issues you have with him. Perception grows of bias in the U.S. valuation experts. This is actually a big deal right now. Bias about 2022 started to show up in the literature. And in the literature, when it showed up, it first was talking about in valuation, real property and discrimination on different areas based on race. Well, since that started in 2022, and the folks in neuroscience were at the same time talking about bias and how to overcome bias. And now you'll notice there are presentations on that. I presented on bias just a few weeks ago here for NACVA. I see other people are making presentations with the AICPA. I've been asked to do this now with some CPA societies. And I'm just commenting to you, this is becoming a much bigger issue. So what are you doing to ensure there's no bias in your report? And that means there's a number of different things. Like when your client says, I want you to do this for me, you may have a bias that comes simply because you want to help out that client. You have a natural affinity towards your client. It may be you have certain data sources you like to use. So you have a bias towards certain data sources versus others, which might skew your analysis because you weren't looking at other sources that maybe you should have looked at. Anyway, this points out it's a growing item. That was back in April, and it's even gotten bigger now. Disconnect woes plague BV firms using remote staff. This was a commentary that says, when we had COVID-19, everybody basically was remote. Now we have people who don't want to come back in, and we have people who we do want to have back in the office so we can have interconnections in the office. I blog on different things weekly. In my blog last week, I pulled up an academic study that was done over a 4-year period talking about in office versus are you connected with each other? Are you connected in some way with each other? And they found out if you make the point to be connected, that is, I make the point that we're going to actually just socially engage periodically, just like if you're in the office and you walked into somebody's room, their office, and just talked with them about how are things going or what happened over the weekend, or what's going on with wife, kids, pets, sports, whatever it might be. You need to do that with people who are remote too. And this new article I'm bringing up said, if you do those kind of things, you can have as powerful as a connection as you did as if they were with you, but you need to make the effort to do it. Well, this article said, looking at BV firms, remote staff, especially newer people, you need to make sure they do come into the office and interact, or they can become isolated. They won't be developed as quickly. They're doing their thing, but if they don't interconnect with others in the office, that really doesn't help them. On the other hand, if you bring them in the office and you don't connect with them in the office either, that doesn't really serve a purpose. If you're just coming in the office to be there. I know a person who works for a major entity, and his employees are foreign employees. They're all over the world, but he has none in this geographic location. But he's been ordered to come back in the office. So he says, okay, I go in the office. There's nobody in the office that's part of my team. And the work that we do is unique. They're problem solvers at a very high level. So he said, there's nobody in the office I interact with. So I have people that'll say, do you want to go for a walk? And they'll go for a walk. But he doesn't have anybody in his team. So you got to think about that really isn't benefiting that guy with his team to go into the office if he's not interacting with anybody. The valuation of controlling ownership interest in the context of gift and tax planning. This was an article by Tim Meinhardt, who's from Willamette. And in his article, he talked about if you're involved with estates or gifts, and you have a controlling interest, what are the things you need to look at in terms of a discount for lack of marketability? And how about for a discount for lack of control? And there's a court case that's come out and said there was a discount for lack of control in a controlling entity. Think about that for a second. But also take a look at your discount for lack of marketability. How long will it take for this firm to sell? If you're a 100% owner, is this a firm that's going to take 9 months or a year or 2 years to sell out in the market? Because it's not like people are standing around waiting to buy that business. And then here's a checklist for reviewing valuation reports discount rate. I thought that was very helpful. You think of a checklist for reviewing a report, but this said, take a look at how you would review somebody else's discount rate. As many of you know, I'm a mediator. I mediate 2 to 4 times a month all over the country, and I'm involved with business valuations. And when I meet with the parties, I'm looking for people who want to mediate, and the decision maker can say, I can move at least 10%. So it could be 10-90, 90-10, or it's going to be somewhere in between, but they're willing to say I can move off of my number. Having said that, when you think about your discount rate, when I'm talking with an expert and they're there with their attorney and they're there with their client, and I'll ask them, how'd you come up with the risk-free rate? Well, why did you choose that? Well, why didn't you choose a normalized rate? If you chose 20-year T-bill or treasuries, why not 10-year treasuries? Well, that's what I always do. Well, that's what I always do is not a very good answer versus here's why I do it. And yes, those other things are things that could be used. You're showing that you've made a decision as an expert of what you want to use and why, but it doesn't mean that's the only answer that it could be. But I give that as an example of starting off with a checklist for reviewing valuation reports discount rates. This was an article, a presentation that I made. It's Mike Gregory on generational differences. I was asked to do that because I've made many presentations to CPA societies on how to hire, train, and retain the best people. And with that, I've done a lot of research into generational differences and what do different individuals want if you're in a different category. I'm a baby boomer and my kids are millennials. So we have very different views of the world. So in looking at CPA societies and the CPAs that they're bringing on board, we need to make connections with people. So how do you relate to one another? How can you relate to me and I can relate to you? And I give the example that for my own kids, both my kids are married. Both my kids were in or are still in fantasy football leagues. I'm not with them now, but one year they needed to have another player, so I joined. Well, for me, that was not in my comfort zone. I could care less about fantasy football, but I give that as an example of you need to get out of your comfort zone and get into where other people are and find out how you can relate to them, one another, and that your people are far more important than your profits. And don't assume that my experiences are your experiences and what can we both learn from each other. Everybody wants to be appreciated. And I can tell you from my mediations, everybody wants respect. Everybody wants to be listened to. Everybody wants to know that they matter. So what can you do? You need to have an intention to do that, not just assume what's going to happen. So that was that particular presentation. In July, Fernanda's study on 2024 risk premiums and risk-free rates. That's something I subscribe to and get every year. It's always interesting to me. Supreme Court sides with IRS on the COLI valuation dispute. And that's one that I'll be talking about that next month with another update on that article, or an article by Greg Caruso. But basically, the court said that if you have insurance and you have a firm and somebody dies and that insurance comes over to the firm, that's an asset in the firm. And that it had a mixed decision in 2 different lower courts, and the Supreme Court said, nope, that's how you need to value that. And what I'll talk about next month will be an article that Greg Caruso wrote. He's an attorney and a CPA, and he talks about ways that could be addressed given the fact pattern that took place in this case. A few concerns in our survey on quality control. Not every firm does it. Many do, but that's an area that you can look at for concern going forward. Rule 702, that's for being an expert in the federal courts, and many of the states have adopted that as well. They've taken some sharper perspectives relative to who's going to be admitted. And appraisers have a fairly high percentage of not being admitted. I don't remember the percentage now. It was over 30%. It was higher than other folks who are attorneys or CPAs or economists, and the appraisers were the highest percentage of being disallowed by the court. Investigating the sensitivity of the size premium. This is a good article that took a look at the size premium and different sources that could be used to determine the size premium. There were over a half dozen presented. 2 BV trends that have alarmed BVR's power panel, And these have to do with, are you meeting your standards? And are you properly determining discount for lack of marketability given sources that are out there? Those are their two biggest concerns. Understanding the role of memory in interviews. This is a really cool article. Again, I work with some neuroscientists, 4 of them now for over 10 years. Our memories play lots of tricks. Our memories like to have things that are right and wrong. Our memories like to remember things a certain way. And this talked about when you're interviewing people to make sure you're asking the questions the right way, and that when you're interviewing people, you're really paying attention to their answers. And then using expert witnesses in arbitration proceedings. This is an important context to look at what takes place in arbitration that is different than going to court, and what do you need to know as an expert witness if you're going into arbitration. Jointly retained valuation engagements, a roadmap for trust and cooperation. This is, you're an expert for both sides. So both sides have said, I want to have a valuation, and both sides have said, I want to have you be our valuer. This takes place in cooperative divorces quite a bit. So you want to take a look and say, if folks are willing to cooperate one another, do you want to be an expert in that space? And would you want to hold yourself out as an expert in your market segment for people who are looking for that kind of expertise? And then Gregory reveals what's going on with the IRS and tax valuations. This is me talking from an article that was in BV Update when I made a presentation to the New York State Society of CPAs. But it updated you with where things are. I have a presentation I'm making in Portland here at the end of the month, and I'm making one in Milwaukee, then I'm off to Naples, and I'm talking about these kind of what's going on with the IRS right now. And they're in a big period of transition right now. That wasn't in that article, but it is now, because they're in a pause relative to hiring. If they were in the process of hiring you and they were hiring, you're still coming on board. But they put in a pause of new hiring. They're not sure what's going to happen with the budget. Elon Musk with his group are taking a look at all the federal agencies, and the federal agencies are saying, we might get cuts here. We may not have as much. And they're in an article that was in the Washington Post last week, it talked about 400 less audits potentially in the large and business international division of large corporations and global high wealth folks, and what that might mean in other areas of audit here as well. So depends on what's going to happen with the new president, the new budget. That wasn't in that particular presentation by me, but that's a soundbite of where we are today. And then IRS and business valuation issues. This was an interview with an IRS senior appraiser from Jacksonville, Florida, Mark Bovey. He shared with us how things work at the IRS with him, the current hiring plans that they had at that time, which have now since changed. That's how quickly things move. What do you want an audience to know? Follow your standards. Do the right thing. Be able to document what you have. Be able to explain what you have to someone who's not a valuer. Because if the estate and gift tax attorney or the agent can understand it and doesn't have to bring on board a valuer, he'll never have to get involved. If they've got questions because they don't understand, a greater probability he will get involved. And where does he see the IRS going on valuation issues? Pretty much continuing to do what they're doing, but more work in the international arena, more work in partnerships, more work in 1120Ss. Those were some of the things that he brought up with pass-through entities and international related work. And then the continuing education with the build-up method. This was kind of fun to me to read that, because it talked about a number of different things to think about with the build-up method and the different elements that go into that. And then BV Mythbusters tackle exit multiple versus Gordon growth. And it said, whether you use an exit multiple or Gordon growth, both should end up with the same answer. So that was kind of interesting, that depending on what your assumptions are, and you can use either one and get the same answer, but depends on how you build that up. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move through a whole host of slides. We're on slide 41, and I'm going to skip ahead all the way to 69, because these slides are all the references that I pulled out in the course of the year. So I'm just going through these very quickly. I'm not going over them, but you've got them, so you can take a look at the references that have been given to you in the course of the year. So what did we do? We went over 2 interviews with key players, 1 presentation, 72 articles were highlighted, but I came through and just gave you 24 of them. 51 reference links are still here. And with that, this is my intention to give you information that you can use. And if you've got thoughts on things you'd like me to talk about, or you've got thoughts on what you think you'd like to have, I'm more than happy to do this. And this work doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are 2 people in particular that I want to recognize. When I'm not here in a given month, Janie Castell is one of the folks. She's going to be on a session here later today. She's the managing director here of Rava Valuation Advisors, Value Advisors. She's got lots of experience. She's located in Tulsa, Oklahoma. She's a very kind, considerate person. She's a very professional person. She knows what she's doing, and she's very easy to work with. It's my pleasure to work with her as we put things together for Around the Valuation World. And when she fills in for me, I know you've got a top quality person. And I'm glad she only does it periodically, or I might not be able to do this with you. But thank you very much, Janae, for all that you do. And the other person in here is James Ewert. He's located in Charleston, South Carolina. A lot of experience. He was with Dixon Hughes here for 16 years. He's another person who fills in for me when I can't be here. He does excellent work. And I appreciate that when he fills in, he's got additional ideas to make the presentation even better too. Here's another quality individual. He's another one of our presenters, and he does great work, and I enjoy working with him. And I don't have a slide in here for Chinda, but Chinda makes this work every month for us. He's an outstanding administration person. He pulls us together to make sure our presentations are pulled together each month. Sometimes it can be like herding cats with us because we're not always the best at getting our things in as timely as we should, but he's great at putting together the presentation, bringing it up, and making the rest of us look good. And we wouldn't have this if we didn't have Chinda making this happen for all of us. So I want to make sure we thank him as well. Well, these are the different sources that were used in the course of this past year. So I don't look at every one of these every month, but I look at every one of these, I'd say at least every other month. And I try to pull out some articles out of these different sources that I think you might find the most interesting to listen to and learn from. If you've got other sources that you would like me to look at, I'm open to that too. I look at this as part of my continuing professional education. I enjoy being on here with you, and I hope you enjoy these presentations as well. And again, as with the last session that I just finished up, if you have any questions or comments, or you want to get in touch with me, that's my contact information. I'm here to help. The call is free. And if I can point you in the right direction to someone else, I'd be happy to do that too. I have a newsletter now that's got just over 31,000 names associated with a monthly newsletter. And I send that out. And if folks don't want it, you can always unsubscribe. But I do that with the intention of, I just want to help make our profession and make our country a little bit better. So with that, I'm going to wrap up my session here. And Chinda, I'm going to send this back. Are we going to go to Elena, or are we going back to Mel? And there's another question.
We are going to Shanda, actually. Thank you,
We're
Mike.
going to Chinda. Okay.
Yes.
Chinda,
Yeah.
take it away, and I'll
Little,
stop sharing here.
Thank you.
There you go.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Alina. Just real quick before we go on to the next session, play a little quick video for you. Let me just share the screen and then we'll go with it.
Windy Street is a prominent outsourcing firm in India that offers a comprehensive suite of services, including valuation, financial due diligence, accounting, auditing, and tax. Founded 3 years ago, with a clear vision to provide exceptional services to professional and accounting firms, we now proudly serve over 15 clients. Our success is built on our unwavering commitment to the values of trust, quality, and people. Our team of over 150 skilled professionals is led by a highly experienced leadership team. We bring unmatched expertise and dedication to every client relationship. At Windy Street, we believe in putting people at the heart of everything we do, our clients, our team, and our community. We also prioritize complete security and a robust IT infrastructure, ensuring that our clients' privacy and data are safeguarded at all times. With Windy Street, you're not just a client, you're a partner in a journey toward excellence.
Thank you, Chanda. And now we have our next session. It is very interesting because when we were planning today's show, I was talking to Chanda and we were discussing the issues with hurricanes and earthquakes. And now I think this topic is even more relevant with the California wildfires. So our hearts go out to everyone who's going through such tough times right now. And today we will be talking about how to handle business interruption, how to calculate losses, and the importance of acting quickly when these things happens. And we are lucky to have Kerrie Merrifield. She's going to be interviewed by Stephen White. So Stephen, you can take it from here.
Thank you very much, and Happy New Year again to everyone. Um, it is a timely situation that we're getting ready to talk about. I will have to make a comment. Michael, that was a fantastic presentation you did. It's very hard to follow behind you anytime, but you gave a lot of great information there, and it is truly, truly worthwhile to jump on a monthly basis to hear you. And to follow up behind you, we are going to be talking about business interruption loss calculations. And our guest today for this segment is Kerrie Merrifield. For those of you who are not familiar with Kerrie, Kerrie has been working in accounting, forensic business valuation litigation support for roughly over 35 years. Her main focus is actually on complex civil litigation, forensic accounting, business valuation, economic damage analysis, as well as family law matters. So we're very pleased and happy to have you here with us today. Kerrie, how are you?
I'm good, Stephen. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
No, our pleasure, our pleasure. Now, as I mentioned, you're going to be presenting later on today on a session for business interruption loss calculations. And as Alina alluded to, you know, it is not only is it relevant, it's a very timely presentation for you to be delivering for our audience right now. And I think understanding the potential financial losses that businesses may be forced to have for unforeseen disruptions like natural disasters, like Elena mentioned about hurricanes, or what we're experiencing right now in Los Angeles. This makes the theory of business interruptions more of a reality, in my opinion. So you're present, and I've had the opportunity to see it. You basically have taken what I like to consider a 5 to 7 day type training presentation, condensed it into just a 1 day session. So knowing that we only have a short period of time to highlight your session, let's just kind of jump right into the business interruption arena and talk about some of the things that our guests will be able to walk away with after sitting with you. Now, just like anything else in valuation, I like to always believe that the engagement is always the most exciting thing. And you do go over engagements quite a bit in this presentation. Why don't you tell us a little bit about why you think that's one of the most important parts or the first step in as far as business interruption?
Yeah, I'm going to say I do spend, and this is, as you said, I'm condensing. This is a 5-part series. So this is a 15-hour training webinar that I'm condensing into 2. Usually there's 3 hours that I spend on preparing the engagement. And why that's so important is because I relate it to like painting. You know, you spend a lot of time taping around the windowsills and, taping everywhere for the ceiling and all those things. It's very time consuming. But once you prepare everything, you know what you're getting into, then when you do the job, it makes it just so much easier. You know your parameters and you set yourself up for success.
So let me ask you something before you go on, because you made a really interesting point there about the number of hours that your presentation is really, and you condensed it down into this segment here. Is this doing engagements for business interruption, because you've done other types of evaluations as well? How different are they? Is it a major difference, or are they pretty similar as far as preparing for the engagement?
You know, a lot of the situations are going to be different, and sometimes there is some crossover into, say, like business valuations. So if you have a business interruption loss, say it's they call it a catastrophic loss, you're going to be kind of gearing more towards a business valuation type of things. Or you can have it's somewhat maybe like a lost profits, but with business interruption losses, there are just specific nuances, usually spelled out in the policies and ways of calculating it that are a little bit different than doing lost profits.
Okay, well, that makes a lot of sense. So that leads me right into my next question, because as we're all aware that during the pandemic, site visits, right? That was a big topic of discussion. Do you go? Have they tapered off? They slowed down. For us, it did slow down quite a bit. But when we're talking about business interruptions, and especially during the time that we're in right now, how important is site visits for what you do as far as business interruptions?
I'm going to say site visits are always best
Hmm.
if possible, but doing this type of work, there can be circumstances where it's not possible. Take, for example, if um, the hurricanes that they had in the Carolinas, some people can't even still even get to some of the places. So a site visit in that case, might not be possible. So there's other things you can do, and sometimes, like, I've been brought in on something that was maybe several years ago. So that actual site and damage does not still exist. So, but you'll have maybe insurance photos. You can use Google Earth. There's some people that can use drones. So there's a wide variety. But if you can make the site visit in person, that's always absolutely the best thing to
Hmm.
do.
So you're going to go over that a little bit more as far as the different types of site visits that you've been a part of during this session later on.
Yes, yes. As
Okay.
part of, and that's in preparing the engagement, is
Okay.
figuring out if you can go, if you can't go, what are your alternatives, and getting the information that you need.
Okay, and that is so important as far as what you do and how you actually deal with it. Like I said, business interruption is a completely different species from what we do here at Honest Partners Group. So it was really enlightening for us to kind of go through it and see the different things that you're going through for your presentation, which leads me to one of the things that I like to do whenever I sit down in these types of events is to have takeaways, right? And I look at case studies as a fantastic way of learning. Are you going to be discussing any particular type of case study, or can you share with us a little highlight of something that you might be covering as far as a case study?
Yeah, so going through this, when I talk about planning the engagement, the insurance policy, the calculations, all that type of stuff, there is one specific case that I am using, and it's one that I had a couple years ago. And I like using this case because I came up against almost every obstacle you're going to come up against. So I thought it was a really good case to really kind of show, like, hey, if there's no records, what can you do? If it's years after the event, what can you do? All these things. So there is one specific case that I am going to use throughout the presentation to talk about.
Okay. All right. So let me take a step back here for a moment because you've been a subject matter expert in this arena for quite some time now. Do you see business interruption going through an evolution, or where do you see the biggest challenges that evaluators are running across with business interruption?
I'm gonna say is, first of all, knowing really what it is and how it really isn't like just lost profits, and getting people educated to know how to perform these services correctly. I've had to do a lot of rebuttal reports, and you can have CPAs that can do business valuations or just do other financial work that don't understand the unique things, and maybe constraints or different things that go along with a business interruption loss calculation. So I find there's a lot more opportunities to do it just because we're having so many, natural disasters that are impacting large areas. But it's just like, I guess, kind of getting enough qualified people to perform these analysis.
And I'm glad you mentioned that the qualified individuals to do this because it is unique, right? And when you and I spoke prior to you coming on here, and I share with you what we focus our attention on, we look at M&A and ESOPs, and we feel as though those are very complex and they're a very specialty thing. But business interruption is a different species in itself. And you need the expertise and the training in order to be a subject matter expert in this particular arena. You are going to be talking about calculations during this time, during your session here. And I know that this is probably not the time that you can actually go through step by step. But it would be great for our audience just to have an idea of how in depth you will go through that particular section, because I think the understanding the loss calculation theory is going to be extremely important for business interruption, correct?
Yes, definitely. So we'll go over, there's two different methods of calculating. They pretty much come out to the same thing in the end, but it's going to depend on what information you have available to you. And we'll go over like, when you don't have a lot of times when the businesses are completely destroyed, you don't even have financial information. How do you go back and calculate it? Then we'll integrate that with what's in the policy. And that's why, the policy is so important. What type of constraints do you have? Are there limitations on time, on certain expenses? Are they included, excluded? Making sure you can do extra expenses and different things like that. So we'll go into how it relates to the policy and how the calculations are done and the things that are different about this than maybe other loss calculations that you may do.
And what are those methods that you're referring to?
There's one called the bottom up and then one called the top down, gross profit and net income methods. It's just start whether you want to start at the top of the profit and loss statement with the sales, or and go down, or do you want to just start at the bottom net income and work your way up?
Okay. And that's something that you would work with the clients as far as gathering all the information and then kind of walk them through that overall process, or how does that all come into play?
Yeah, so when I'm doing this with a client, I mean, I'm not going to walk the client through the method really, but I would really go
Mhm.
through like the profit and loss statements to understand how they do their accounting and how their business works, go through every single line item with them. Is this something that's going to continue during this period of restoration? Is this you're going to have an extra expense? And we'll get into what extra expenses are. I'll just give a quick example. Like say you
Mhm.
have a restaurant and it's partially burned, you can't operate there. So an extra expense would be renting another location. So, we'll get into those things. So, going through this with the business owner, maybe not in the exact way that and I would go through it with an expert, but going through every line item in their profit and loss statements to understand and so they understand what's going on, what's included, what's not included, um, according to the policy.
So as you went through that, and I reflect back on the segment that Mike Gregory talked about with AI, right? And how AI is generating some of the reports there. I think it would probably be really challenging. And I don't know if you're going to go over this during your session as far as what you do, your expertise that you bring in to business interruption and incorporating AI into this. I don't know if that's something that you've dealt with, work with right now, or it's just not a part of what your focus is.
Yeah, as far as for this presentation, I'm not gonna go over anything on that.
Mhm.
I haven't used AI for any of these. So, it's something definitely since it's becoming so much more prevalent and, even in what we do, that's something I'm starting to kind of think about and how I would use it, but it's not part of this presentation though.
But you can probably imagine it would be real challenging in this particular area.
Yes, and I think that's probably one of the reasons why I haven't used it to date or really
Hmm.
even thought about it is just because every situation can be so different and there's just so many different things you need to consider that yet I'm not comfortable leaving it to just a machine. But yeah, so
No, you're 100% right. I think a lot of evaluators are in your have your same opinion as well. Um, so a couple of things that as we wrap up, and I know that we're coming to a close here on this. Your session is going to be later on today, and of course, business interruption is a very complex area. You're going to walk through a number of different scenarios. You're going to talk about a couple of different case studies so people can have something to walk away with. What I will ask you this, because I do believe that this area is building up to a place where they're going to look for experts in the business interruption area. And I think your segment that you're going to go over and any other type of training that NACVA can offer out to our audience is going to be invaluable. That said, what type of person should probably be a part of this particular session if they're interested in BI? What kind of background should they have in this, or should they be already in the process of doing business interruption loss calculation?
I'm going to say it's kind of going to be a mix. I would say definitely having
Mhm.
a background in business valuation is a huge plus. Having a CPA, working, really truly understanding finances, how business works, and things like that, and value is important, but somebody that likes challenges, you have to really, because this is one area, these are the types of cases I find I get the most challenges in getting information and maybe having to recreate things. So I'm gonna say definitely if you like the challenges, instead of like, some people just like here's everything straight up. Here's the numbers. Here's
Right.
the documents. Just do the calculations. Put your spin on it or whatever. But this was going to be something where you have to be able to address a lot of challenges in real time. If you like doing lost profits or things like that, I would say this is definitely anybody that's in the financial arena that calculates any kind of damages and things like that would definitely might enjoy this type of work. And get to feel good. You feel like you're helping a business
Right.
through a hard time. If it's been destroyed to some extent. So you feel like
Mhm.
you actually get to help, which I like that aspect of it as well.
Hey, you hit on some really key points there, things like challenging, you're helping. And as I mentioned, the areas that we focus our attention on, that's essentially what we're doing here. Now, just a little sneak preview. And it doesn't have to necessarily come from your overall presentation in itself. You talked about challenges, and you and I talked about a couple of things prior to this. What would you say your biggest challenge type of case that you've worked on so far?
That's actually the one that's going to be in this
Ah.
presentation. I can just tell you it's something that happened like 4 or 5 years before I was even brought in. It was a flood. There was no financial records. So there were a lot of issues and that came about on this. So it gives me a chance to address that. I would say that was my most, I don't want to say difficult, but most
Uh-huh.
challenging case. So
Yeah, it definitely sounds like it. We actually have a question. Are you going to be going over marketing or networking to be able to for this type of work or any other types of nuts and bolts in your sessions?
yeah, there's going to be at the end we do it's called the opportunities section. So it's going to give what different types of opportunities there are and ways to get them. So I guess yeah, we'll be covering that kind of in general at the end of the presentation.
Okay. All right. Well, Kerrie, I think we're right at the end of our session here. Again, the name of your presentation for today is going to be Business Interruption, Loss Calculations. I appreciate your time here. It's going to be an exciting presentation. You're going to be covering a lot of great things, and I'm looking forward to being a part of it. I'm sure a number of people are looking forward to signing up to be a part of this as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And the presentation starts, I believe, in an hour. So if anybody that hasn't signed up wants to sign up, that's interested in this, please feel free to do so, and then I'll see everybody in an hour.
All right. Thank you. Elena, I
Thank
guess I'll
you.
turn it back over to you now.
Just really quick before we go over there.
Oh,
Yeah, this is Chinda
Chanda,
real quick.
Mr. Champion yourself. There you go.
Thanks, yes. That was unexpected. Um, but thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Kerrie, for joining
Not a
us today.
problem.
I just want to note in your material, there is a link to register for the webinar. So, and just joining us today for the show, there is a promotion code that you can use to get 20% registration. So go to the materials, click on the link, and register for that using the code, and join Kerrie after this webcast. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mel, who will get us started with the judges session today.
Wonderful. Thanks, Chinda. Going to be a fun session this afternoon. And this is one of the favorite sessions of the program every single month. This is with the honorable judges and the judges panel asking questions. And Alan Zipp, he's going to be the one that's going to, I can't say interrogate the judges, right? Just interview the judges. And Alan is a wealth of knowledge, JD, CPA, and I just found out he still does tax returns. We're gonna have to get him out of that, and everything. But he's going to be talking to the judges about how do you deal with the lack of documentation and or cash basis valuations, which I think that a lot of us deal with a lot, Alan. So this is going to be really interesting. I'm going to turn it over to you right now.
I certainly appreciate that. Let me get my screen up here. And firstly, let me say that I have to get this right. I don't know how to do this. Um, Technology and I don't get along. Oh, here we go. Okay. We have Judge Driscoll from New York and Judge Platt from Maryland and Judge Yates from Michigan. I hope we're all together. It's hard for me to tell. The issue that we're going to talk about today is that we need tips from the judges on how we as expert witnesses should handle the cash basis business valuations, and we have a lack of reliable documentation. And we deal with this too often, I'm afraid. Um, I'm going to skip through the bios. You'll have that in your material. And let me begin by talking about the rules that we have to follow. And then, judges, please give us your thoughts on how you see our application of these rules. NACFA standards require us to obtain sufficient relevant data to afford a reasonable basis for conclusions, recommendations, or positions. This is called due professional care. Now, Federal Rule 702 requires that our testimony is based on sufficient facts or data, and that testimony is the product of reliable principles and methods. And then Federal Rule 703 allows the admission of our opinions if the court finds that experts in our field would reasonably rely on those kinds of facts or data. And then I comment here, credibility is clearly the most important rule of all. Here's a series of businesses that operate with cash, may not have good accounting records. Bars, restaurants, food trucks, farmers markets, automobile repair shops, kiosks, small pop-up shops, handyman construction services, landscaping services, barber shops, hair salons, laundromats, and the cannabis retail stores are all cash. Uh, and purposes in a litigation context. There's several that want to give you a springboard to talk about marital property and valuation of business of divorce cases, shareholder disputes and dissolution actions. Then you have breach of contract in the purchase or sale of a business. Then there's tax fraud. Then you fail to repay bank loans when you've given them applications that say you make a whole lot more money. Now, what we do as appraisers is make we call normalization adjustments to estimate earning capacity. And where the books and records are incomplete and don't tie into invoices and bank statements, what do? We go to industry data for cost of sales, gross revenue, and we impute that based upon some verifiable costs, expenses. And now the question we pose is, how does the court view imputed revenue where company-specific documentation is lacking? So let me just throw it out for the judges say.
Well, let me start with this. Imputing income is a concept that's familiar to judges, albeit in a less sophisticated way. Most judges wind up, whether they like it or not, starting in family court. And there, it's fairly common when you're trying to sort out either spousal support or child support to impute income to somebody who clearly doesn't seem to be earning half as much as they should be. And so when we start out as baby judges, it's ingrained in us that there's nothing wrong with imputing income. Now, all you have to do as an expert to make the jump to imputing revenue or any other figure for a much more sophisticated entity is make that connection for the judge, because it's a concept that we readily accept, and it may be more complicated, but there's nothing particularly unacceptable about the fact that you're imputing anything in the course of trying to figure out how a company should operate.
I would add to that, for sure, the background that Judge Yates just described is the background of most judges who are not business judges or members of the American College of Business Court judges or some background experience. That's what you're dealing with. You're not dealing with somebody who has an opinion independent of that experience. So you may have to explain to them what it is you do and why you did what you did. And the threshold question is, why did you have to impute it all? because it's not going to be clear in the kind of case we're talking about. We're not talking about the limited experience that the judge has, which is also the limited experience most lawyers have in family law matters. And so in the case where you have done all of that and you've imputed income and you're going to have to start off by saying, here's why I had to do what I did, because we don't know what it is you're talking about. Okay. And I say I exclude Judge Yates, myself, and Judge Driscoll and everyone else who's got that background and experience, but that's not the mainstream of what you're dealing with in most courtrooms, in general jurisdiction courtrooms, in state courts. The next question is, why did you do it the way you did it? We don't have the academic background, the experience that you have. The terminology that you used, Alan, to describe what you do when that happens is not going to be known to us, nor are we going to accept it. There's also a group of, let's talk about appellate court judges, and Judge Yates is better qualified to talk about this than I am, but there's at least an argument that can be made that you can't just come up with theories that aren't a part of the record of the case. And if you do, you run the risk of having it sent back to you to do it the way you should do it, which isn't that. So that as an expert, you need to be able to explain why you did what you did, what you did, and why you didn't do it some other way.
On the screen, I've shown a number of reasons that we believe there may be unreported income. For example, a spouse or a business partner or an employee tells me as the expert of cash skimming and cash not being recorded on the books. Then maybe I'll be looking at the personal lifestyle of the individual, of the party, and we're looking at personal expenses that are substantially greater than the business earnings and the compensation reported. Then if you look at personal bank records, we find unexplained sources of deposits, that utility bills are paid in cash without check or direct debit, that no credit card purchases of gasoline for the car or grocery store purchases or even clothing. And bank loan applications report significantly more business income than reported on tax returns. And then on divorce financial statements, they're showing meals and entertainment that are not supported by reported business income. And then on the business side too, we count pizza boxes at a pizza shop and use that to impute. So the thinking is, can you build on this as being, are we giving you enough background for us to impute income this way?
As long as what you're saying makes sense. Look, if you know, what is being a trial lawyer and being part of a trial team as an expert? It's telling stories around the campfire. So is what you're saying about the cash, for example, that's in the business, does it make sense? And so you have to tell a relatable story. So given the number of pizza boxes that we saw this place bring in, and we saw the inventory report on that, we were surprised to learn that the record showed only 3 pizzas and only one had pepperoni topping. And that didn't make sense because the relationship of pizza boxes to pizzas is this. Have it make sense to us. As Judge Platt said, we're generalists. Even those of us who are specialists, like Judge Platt and me and Judge Yates when he was a trial judge, we're still generalists. We still don't know everything you know, and nor will we ever. But what we know how to do is to make sense, I hope we do, out of what it is you're telling us. And you aid us in that process by comparing what you know to a real life scenario. So I think these examples you give, Alan, are absolutely perfect.
Yeah, and I'd say this. All you need to do is have the light go on, the light bulb go on for either the judge or the jury. And Judge Driscoll and I'm sure, share a perspective on this. We were both federal prosecutors for a long time. And you get these cases, somebody in the office has to handle them. They're tax fraud cases. And anytime I got a tax fraud case, the first thing I'd want to see is get me loan applications or personal financial statements. Because what you're going to see almost invariably is inflation of the value of assets on personal financial statements or loan applications, and then minimization of those very same numbers on the tax returns. That's the sort of thing that we always like to have in a case like that, because that's when the light bulb goes on. When people who don't have special experience in this area nonetheless can look at it and think, aha, I get that. That's why the numbers on the tax returns are understated.
Another example would be historic earnings have been substantial, but in recent time, there came an unexplained income deficiency. That's a term of art. How does the court view the use of these past earnings to estimate current earnings, where the past earnings are before the litigation, like before the divorce action, or before the shareholder dispute, or before the tax audit, or the loan payment default, etc.? How does the court view an opinion of value based on less than adequate documentation of the subject business? But we're looking at historical earnings have been much higher.
My answer to that would be, it would depend on the credibility of the expert, period. And the reason it depends on that is because your last question, which is a compendium of the first two, how does the court view an opinion of value based on less than adequate documentation of the subject matter of the subject business? The question is, have you, before you offered that opinion, convinced that there is less than adequate documentation, and why your opinion, based on that admittedly lack of documentation, should matter, should be convincing, and should be persuasive? And if you can do that, or in whatever way, by telling a story or otherwise, that's how the court will view it. The court will not have its own independent view most of the time, unless they have the background that we're talking about, and that's rare. They will not have an opinion to start with, so you can shape that opinion. It's not like you have to battle up against somebody who's already thought about it and has an opinion, and you got to change it, which is a lot more difficult than shaping it. You can shape it, but you better be good at what you do, and what you do would, in this instance, is testify persuasively. Also think, again, as I've said in other programs, matters who you're talking to. You're talking to a judge, you're talking to a jury, you're talking to an arbitrator who does have that background. You're talking to an American College of Business Court judge who's gotten educated on this, and if they didn't have the experience before that. But if you're talking to a generalist who has no background other than maybe what Judge Yates alluded to earlier, the family law that he or she went through when they first started, they're not going to have an opinion, which is in a good thing, because you can shape it.
And picking up on that, the first point Judge Platt made, I think is so important, which is, you've got to show me what is less than adequate, what you expected, and what's less than adequate for me to buy into that premise that you want me to address, which is that you can fill in the gaps. If I don't buy that premise, well, then maybe it's you didn't ask the right questions, and there are no gaps, but you didn't get the information because you didn't ask. So spend some time on what you would expect, what you asked for, what you got, your repeated attempts to supplement your information, and to the extent you were stymied, how and when you were stymied. I think it's just so important to lay that groundwork, because that shows that you didn't come at this with an agenda. You came at this trying to get an answer. You kept trying to get an answer, and given that whoever wouldn't give you the documentation, now you're putting on your thinking cap and perhaps massaging the data a little bit based on what you know and based on your experience. But you don't get there unless you tell me and convince me that there is some kind of gap in the part of the materials you've got.
And as a part of your explanation, you might want to be careful about your explanation as to why you didn't get the adequate documentation. If it comes out as a result of what you're saying, that the jury or judge or whoever is listening to this, informing and you're trying to persuade, concludes the reason you didn't get it is because the attorney who hired you didn't give it to you, that's deadly.
Yeah, that's a bigger problem than the the reality of not having, they don't have the documents. The business does not keep the kind of records that are needed in order to do an appropriate valuation of that company. For example, we talk about the smaller the business itself, the harder it is to prove unreported cash. And
Sure.
that's what's happening here. And so what we do frequently is we look at industry metrics that provides averages of that kind of a business as a percent of revenue, such as owner compensation or cost of sales or employee compensation, rent, advertising, and similar operating costs. The question here now is, when we're using industry averages, how does the court view our opinion of value based on imputing earnings from those industry data, where the books and records of the subject business just don't exist, or they're not complete? And we know that the business receives, or we suspect the business receives substantial cash in the ordinary course of operations.
I would rather have historical performance data from the company itself, but in the absence of that, as you say, and there may be an absence of that, then industry averages are perfectly fine for me. I never struggle with that.
What if they're lying too? Sometimes this comes from tax return data, and
Sure.
if everybody in that
Again.
industry is lying, then what do? We just have to use it.
Retaining counsel should have that conversation, because pretty quick, I'll use my own experience in the last 60 days. I've done 4 quote mediations in in cases involving business valuations. And each time I have walked in and they haven't said, "Excuse me, could you step out? We're having a confidential conversation," in which the attorney was saying to the client, "By the way, if this doesn't work out, make sure you give me those documents we just talked about." Now, that on a scale of 1 to 10 about how stupid that is, that would be a -5. But it's an example of there's not much effort. It's like, okay, let's see if we can settle this case, and then if we can't, then we'll get serious. You got to watch it, because if whatever your role is, if it's assisting in this attempt to settle the case, yeah, you got to watch you don't get the finger pointed at you, which is a social trend in both politics and law. Whose fault is this? It's not your fault you don't have adequate information.
But do we have some liability or exposure, in your view, that we're taking a position that there is unreported income, and that in and of itself is an accusation of fraud, that we are now going to impute value where there's no reported evidence of value. We're creating it. I'm really curious how you see our role in going. How far can we go in imputing value?
I'll say this. Generally, I tell people that I want to see tax returns, because tax returns are the gold standard, because they're signed under penalty of perjury, and you can get in a lot of trouble for lying on tax returns. So if you want to try to convince me that what's on a tax return is fraudulent, you can do that, but you have to persuade me against a presumption that it's valid. With other documents, I'm much less confident that they're accurate. Particularly, as I said, when we were talking about this earlier, personal financial statements, things like that. I mean, you can put anything on there and you're not going to get in any trouble for doing it unless you submit it to a financial institution, then it's bank fraud. But I think all of us would say that we can be persuaded that numbers on a tax return are fraudulent. It just takes some work to get there.
I saw a question on the chat from Janae, actually, about whether we're ever comfortable relying on expert average financial data, and Judge Yates said he's comfortable with it. I mean, obviously, we're not creating a blanket rule, but I had Shannon Pratt come and testify in my courtroom in the Arizona ISD case, And he was subject to cross-examination just like every other witness, and he was darn good. I don't remember exactly what my findings were with respect to what he said or what he didn't say, but if you can have somebody explain that industry data, and have that person be a good witness, that's part of the process, as we've been saying.
Again, I would just say, do not assume that whoever you're talking to, unless you have information that tells you otherwise, that they know half of what you know about what you did and why you did it. And if they do, great. But do not assume that. And then if they do not, or if you're in doubt about it, don't feel, you don't want to be condescending. You don't want to talk down, but because that's deadly for other reasons. But you do want to explain and what you did, why you did it, and why there's really no alternative to doing what you did the way you did it.
Standing. Yeah, judges, you are terrific. You're giving us some practical advice that we need, and because we end up presenting testimony on our opinion, and that opinion is got to be using our professional standards and our due professional care.
I would just, if I could throw in one thing, just because of some recent experience, I do a lot of malpractice cases, including against CPAs, not so far as many as but the question was, what do you think our liability is? It's not so much what I think, it's what the world thinks. And the world thinks that anybody can be sued for anything. And you need to keep that in mind when you're doing your work. There's also a group that, and again, keep in mind who you're talking to, but I've had, unfortunately, experience recently where, frankly, CPAs, not business valuators, and the three of us understand the difference, but a lot don't, that were sued for just ridiculous reasons. And they had, in effect, as a mediator, as I said to the lawyer who did it, you've hired me to try to tell your client that his expectations are unreasonable. Unfortunately, it looks like you exacerbated the unrealistic expectations, and that's why we're here. So expectations are not easily managed, particularly when you reinforce them initially and then hire a third party to undo them without embarrassing you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Judges, I want to thank you once again. You're terrific. You give us so much insight into what we as expert witnesses need to know. And I see Michael Kaplan is ready to talk. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Michael.
Thank you. And I want to thank our judges, because you got into an area that is, really, really delicate. And this is an area that that I've actually had experience in dealing with for many, many years. I am in my 50th year of professional practice in the area of financial forensics. And one thing that I have learned along the way is that when we as experts come into the courtroom and talk about unreported income, when we talk about income that doesn't appear on the tax return, but may appear on a bank loan application, or may appear on some other official document, and counsel wants you to bring that up in the courtroom in your testimony, you are pulling the pin on the hand grenade. You are pulling the pin on a live hand grenade, and I'll tell you, nothing good will come out of that. I'll give you a couple of situations that I've been involved in where I really learned a lesson. Way back when, we're talking about more than 40 years ago, in my first week in the case, I discovered about $8 million of income that was not reported. It was money that was flowed out of the country through cost of goods sold. and it was not reported as income on the person's tax return. And I was on the witness stand, and I began giving my testimony and testifying about some of the things that I saw in the documentation. And the judge said, we're going to take a recess now. I want to see counsel in chambers. And what did the judge tell counsel in chambers? Are you crazy? Do you want to have Kaplan testifying about this stuff? How do you know the Internal Revenue Service is not going to get their hands on it? Well, as fate would have it, the IRS got their hands on it and shortly thereafter served an $18 million jeopardy assessment on the parties. And that took that case and changed the whole direction of it. If I had life to live all over again, if I could roll back that 40 plus years, I would have had that conversation with my retaining counsel. Are you crazy? Do you really want me to take the stand and testify to this? Had another case about the same time. It was a person in the travel business who used to get these bonus tickets, whatever they were, and year after year after year, he had $55,000 of tickets that he would sell. He would sell them and not report the cash. And the judge, I remember this day just like it was yesterday. The judge said, "Excuse me, Mr. Kaplan, but did these parties report that 50,000, 55,000 on their tax returns each year?" I said, "No." He said, "Okay." And he said, "Excuse me." And then he turned to his clerk and he said, "As a judicial officer, it is my responsibility to notify the Internal Revenue Service when there is evidence of tax fraud in my courtroom. Please draft a letter to the Internal Revenue Service." And I'll tell you, anyway, the court had his clerk send a letter to the IRS, and there was a problem for these people. When there is tax fraud, you've got to step back and let your retaining counsel know. If you're expecting me to build my opinions on numbers that may be real but have not been reported for tax purposes, you're going to have a problem here. Expect that it's going to come back to haunt you and your clients. You need to settle this thing. This thing needs to be settled out of the public court. You need to find a way to get it resolved because no one is going to like the resolution otherwise. No one's going to be happy with that final outcome. And that's the reality of it. We can talk all we want about using industry information and using historical information, and that's fine when everything's been on the up and up. But when there has been fraud and the victim of that fraud has been the Internal Revenue Service, good luck. Good luck. It's not going to have a happy ending. And I've got a lot more that I can say, but I think I've used up my time. And I want to thank our judges. You've been absolutely great, as you continue to be.
Thank you, Michael, and to all our judges for your time today. And you all have our polling question in front of you, so make sure you respond to that. Now we are going to have Michael Mulder. He's going to be discussing the recent decision in Dailey versus Smith by the Superior Court of Pennsylvania. In this particular case, the court clarified the evidence needed to submit a comparative negligence claim to the jury. So let's dive right in. Michael, take it away, please.
Thank you, Alina. So this is where we go. There's a button. All right, that's me. You've seen me before. So this is our case, Dailey versus Smith, coming out of the Superior Court of Pennsylvania. Just to give you a frame of reference, in Pennsylvania, there's 3 levels of court. There's the basic trial court, which is the Court of Common Pleas. The next step up is the Superior Court, which is generally speaking an appeal of right. There is a separate Commonwealth Court that deals with government issues, and to be honest with you, I forget. It's not the sort of normal civil litigation between parties and criminal proceedings. That stuff starts at the Court of Common Pleas and goes up to the Superior Court, and then up from the Superior Court by matter of permission. You file in the same way as the U.S. Supreme Court. You file a request for appeal to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and they can either hear it or not hear it. So this is the intermediate level appellate court in Pennsylvania. This case deals with something that frequently is a confusing thing for a lot of people. This case deals with something called comparative negligence, and what evidence is required in order to be able to submit a comparative negligence claim to a jury. So comparative negligence looks at the universe of fault for something and apportions it between the plaintiff and the defendant and potentially other people who may not actually be parties in the specific litigation. There's another concept that it frequently gets confused with called contributory negligence. Contributory negligence is the same precursor. What it says is, to the extent that the plaintiff is responsible for the thing that happened, they basically don't get any recovery at all. And the question of whether something is comparative negligence or contributory negligence is a state law claim. And it just depends on what state you're in. Pennsylvania happens to be a comparative negligence state. I can't tell you which states are contributory negligence and which ones are comparative negligence. You just have to find out. So here's the story with this case. 2019, there was a traffic accident. The defendant was driving northbound on a fairly major road and making a left turn. Plaintiff was traveling southbound on the same road and collided with the defendant. At the trial, plaintiff testified that the defendant began her turn as soon as he was approaching. Yes, plaintiff was approaching the intersection and it was too late for him to stop, and the defendant had already begun to make her turn. The plaintiff admitted he was driving 30 to 35 miles an hour in a 25-mile-an-hour zone. Again, just to put this in perspective, this particular road in Philadelphia is 2 lanes plus a parking lane in each direction. But it's not a divided highway. Defendant testified that she didn't see plaintiff's car until after she was in the middle of her turn. At the close of evidence, both sides moved for directed verdicts. Plaintiff argued that the defendant was negligent and that her negligence is what caused his injury. In other words, she hit him. The fact that she was negligently making her left turn is what caused the physical injuries that the plaintiff sustained. The defendant, on the other hand, argued that the plaintiff was negligent and speeding, and that the speeding was the reason why there was an accident. Trial court, excuse me, it's very dry in here. Trial court granted the plaintiff's motion, finding that liability against the defendant, and limited the jury to the question of damages. So in a very unusual step, the judge took the liability question out of the hands of the jury and said, okay, you are to assume that the defendant is responsible for plaintiff's injuries. Your job is to award an amount for damages. And the jury did that and awarded $285,000 to that. So that was essentially pain and suffering, and I think some future income loss, and some other miscellaneous things. The parties had stipulated to the amount of medical costs that the plaintiff had incurred as a result of the accident. And the judge, as a matter of law, added delay damages. And for those of you who are not familiar with the concept of delay damages, basically what it says is it's essentially prejudgment interest. And it gets triggered when there is when the defendant has not been forthright in trying to resolve the litigation. Judgments entered on behalf of the on behalf of the plaintiff against the defendant for $300 and some thousand. Excuse me. The defendant appealed the trial court's ruling on the directed verdict in favor of the plaintiff and the failure to allow the jury to consider the comparative negligence issue. Again, comparative negligence, tough word today for some reason, is an allocation of responsibility for the event between the plaintiff and the defendant. And what it does is it doesn't change the analysis of what the loss is. It just apportions between the parties how much of it the plaintiff should be responsible on their own versus how much the defendant should be responsible for. On appeal, Superior Court discussed the things that have to be presented in the trial, that there has to be evidence of two primary factors. One is that the plaintiff was in fact negligent, and that the plaintiff's negligence was a proximate cause of the injuries that for which they are seeking damages from the defendant. And on a motion for a directed verdict, the court is required to view the evidence in the light most favorable to the parties seeking the jury's consideration. So in this case, that means that the trial court was supposed to view the evidence in the light most favorable to the defendant, because it is the defendant who is seeking the jury's consideration of comparative negligence. So the appellate court looked at the testimony in the trial and acknowledged that the plaintiff admitted he was driving 5 to 10 miles per hour over the posted speed limit. That alone, according to the appellate court, was sufficient for the jury to be able to conclude that he was driving negligently. Since speeding is negligence as a matter of law, the trial judge should have put the issue of comparative negligence, or just on the basis of whether or not the plaintiff was negligent, should have put that to the jury and instructed them on what the standard for plaintiff's negligence was. The problem in this case is that the defendant did not proffer an expert who was able to say that the plaintiff's speeding was the cause of the accident. And could not provide additional evidence so this was, again, it's a 3-judge panel. They reversed and remanded for a new trial. And the appellate court pointed out that plaintiff's claim that he was plaintiff's claim that he was too close to stop when the defendant began to make her turn. But he was at the same time far enough away. This is what he is saying, that he's far enough away that she should have been able to see him and know that there wasn't enough room to make that turn. Contradictory versions of facts is in almost every case the exclusive province of the jury, fact finder. So if you have a jury trial, it's going to be the jury making that finding. And so while this is the dissent. So again, 3-judge panel 2 ruled that for reversal of the trial court decision. The dissent said that while speeding may be per se negligence, there was no evidence that the amount by which he was exceeding the speed limit was sufficient to be the proximate cause of the accident. And if it is not a proximate cause of the injuries, then you don't have contributory negligence or comparative negligence. Sorry. See, even I get confused on it. So from the dissent's perspective, it was not a simple question for the jury to believe one party's version versus the other party's version. There had to have been evidence in order to for the dissent, in order to reverse the underlying court decision. There had to be evidence provided that, but for his speeding, that the accident would have not occurred at all. So again, this is back to the two things you need to have evidence of to get comparative negligence to the jury. One is that the plaintiff was negligent in their actions. And the second one is that that negligence was approximate cause of the injury sustained. And what the dissent is saying is that without expert testimony, there was no way for a jury to conclude that the accident would not have occurred but for the plaintiff's speeding. So big things to look at from this is in almost every case you're going to deal with, it is not for a judge to evaluate the facts. That is the job for the fact finder. So unless it is a bench trial, the judge should not be weighing the evidence, should not be deciding who is more credible or less credible. That is the responsibility of the fact finder. And the other thing that I think is important in this case is, as the defense noted, even if you have per se negligence on the part of a plaintiff, that does not imply causation. And so there has to be, and again, this is getting back to our role as expert witnesses, and I am literally seconds away. Our role as expert witnesses is to provide that link from, not necessarily in every case, because we may not be testifying on causation, but causation is necessarily going to be required to be shown, and frequently that will require expert testimony. Cases available on the key value data database. If you can't get it that way, feel free to let me know and I will send it out to you, and I will stop sharing. So Mel, you can go back to it.
All right, man.
Was that fast enough?
It's a fascinating case, so I appreciate it. All right, so we're going to move right into our final presentation of the program. We've got a polling question up now to make sure that you answer that. This one is Janae Castell is going to be having a conversation with Stephen Dotterer, talking about growing your brand, growing your business and everything, and the elements of data asymmetry in valuation disputes. I am looking forward to trying to make sure I understand what this is, how it plays out and everything. And so I'm going to turn it over to you, Janae and Stephen, and let you take it away. You're muted.
Janae, you're muted.
Thanks. Got my video, didn't get the mute button. Thank you. So Stephen Dotterer is the Director of Business Valuation and Litigation Support at H2R CPA in Pittsburgh. He is currently the chair of the EOB, the Ethics Oversight Board, and he has his JD in addition to an MBA and his NACVA Valuation and Forensics certifications. So that will provide a unique perspective. Stephen has prepared a presentation on data asymmetry. So, Stephen, could you provide us with some general context for the development of this segment, how it relates to what you've been working on with the Ethics Oversight Board, and we're going to get into how this affects all of our attendees' practices and, growing their practice, maintaining their practice, and their professional ethics.
Sure. Thanks, Janae. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for jumping on today. So the Ethics Oversight Board has been considering a variety of cases in our last few meetings, and I wanted to help crystallize some of the themes that we've been seeing in the ethics cases for the membership without alluding to specific facts and circumstances that would identify individuals or parties. So one of those themes is what I'm calling data asymmetry. And this topic actually coincides with the discussion that the judges put forth earlier about cash basis financials and the limitations of certain types of data. So Alan and I actually discussed this briefly, that this segment also relates to what the judges so ably said previously.
Great. So many of our listeners may be familiar with information asymmetry and data skew. You chose the term data asymmetry specifically. So can you tell us what you mean by data asymmetry?
Sure. And next slide, please. So the distinction that I'm making can be elucidated through use of data.gov's definition of information versus data. Data is like the raw clay, and information is like the finished product. So when I'm saying data asymmetry here, I'm calling it a state of inequality in documents or representations furnished to one valuation analyst but not the other by knowledgeable parties who could be management or owners. And a lot of the time, this issue arises in cases of shareholder disputes or partner disputes. It can be either litigated or non-litigated buyout situations. It can happen in divorce cases. And oftentimes, one valuation analyst may have access to a particular set of representations, and the other analyst does not have that information. So that gives rise to what I'm calling data asymmetry. Perhaps one side has a particular pro forma financial statement that management prepared that was not furnished to the other side, and maybe for some reason the other side wasn't aware of its existence. But then when you get into the courtroom or you start discussing the case with the other side, you have this pro forma financial statement sprung on you, and you say, I've never seen that before. Well, that's obviously a bad result. So I'm using the word data here rather than information, also to distinguish between trading asymmetries that may develop in the public markets, and to distinguish from transaction asymmetries, which may occur when one party has access to certain information in the context of a transaction. What we're talking about here is more data asymmetry with respect to the development of an opinion or a conclusion of value, but that doesn't mean that data asymmetry can't give rise to information asymmetry.
Right. So let's assume that we have an issue of data asymmetry. What are some ways that we can bridge this gap between, one party that has information and another party that doesn't, or maybe where each party just has a different set of information?
Sure. So in litigation, discovery will often help bridge that gap, and the judges talked about that a little bit. Michael Kaplan gave a really good example of how sometimes there'll be these off-the-record conversations in the courtroom about, let's have them testify to this, and then let's get that document after this if we can't settle it. Well, that seems to happen a lot more than we think. So, I'm glad that he brought that up. So discovery is a good mechanism to get information in a context where there's data asymmetry and litigation. If it's a non-litigated buyout or another situation like that, the types of documents that may give rise to this type of asymmetry are missing tax returns or financials that Alan and the judges were talking about. The existence or lack thereof of real estate appraisals or compensation studies. And you'll often find in these disputed valuation analyses that parties give drastically different indications of what fair market rent or fair market compensation should be. So sometimes one side may commission a study, and you may not be aware of that until the 11th hour that they say, oh, by the way, we have an appraisal that was done on the real estate, or a compensation study that was done on the fair market value of the officer compensation. Other things that one side might have but not the other are capital expenditure and net working capital forecasts, as there's probably some judgment involved in those. And contractor backlog estimates are another one that I just threw in there because those seem to tend to arise in, especially in construction and in contracting disputes.
Okay, great. What are some alternatives? Well, actually, do you want to elaborate on any other ways to bridge the gap on this slide?
Sure. So I mentioned the document request as part of both litigated and non-litigated situations. And I think the engagement letter is probably one of the most important items to consider. So you get out in front of this problem before the problem arises. And that's where it's really important to be exhaustive in the terms and conditions that you set out. And what happens if you don't get the information that you request in the context of preparing a calculation or an opinion of value? Um, are you going to withdraw from that engagement? Are you going to continue with the engagement subject to the requirement that you receive that data? There are a number of different ways to approach it, but the engagement letter needs to really spell out what you're going to do if you reach an impasse where you think, well, I can't really issue a bona fide calculation or conclusion of value unless I get this type of information. And sometimes in mediation or certain other forums, there may be a limit to the number of questions you can ask. And so if you only have 5 questions, you may be somewhat limited in that. But if you know that ahead of time, you can put some of those items into the document request and the engagement letter itself. I find that asking for management interviews is very helpful, and that is often in the non-litigated setting, but also in the litigated setting, you may be able to set it up as a deposition. The problem there is that not all parties want to pay for a deposition, but you may be able to still get some kind of informal management interview that can be set up with the attorneys without being a formal deposition. Submitting written interrogatories to counsel can also be helpful, and that can help bridge the gap. And Alan and the judges mentioned this quite a bit, that third-party data sources can sometimes help bridge the gap when data is missing. And those are sources like BizMiner, for instance, that may report a percentage of capital expenditures of a percentage of net revenue, or officer compensation as a percentage of net revenue. RMA is another source that does a similar type of analysis. So there are ways to help bridge the gap, but as the judges alluded to, it's really based on the credibility of the overall presentation rather than the fact that you just extracted a percentage from BizMiner and applied it blindly, because you're going to see a lot of small companies. The local flower shop is not necessarily going to have the same operating structure as a billion-dollar manufacturing company. So you kind of have to apply the data with professional judgment, I would say.
Like as Alan alluded to, some of the different sources that may have certain biases, they're collected from different types of data. So being aware of that, and if you are available or able to avail yourself to multiple sources to kind of look at which one might have a high skew and which one might have a, might minimize net income.
And I know in particular, RMA will list the number of sources that come from reviewed financials, audited financials, tax returns, and other sources. So RMA in particular breaks out the reliability of that information if you ever look in that box.
Absolutely. Great. So what are now some alternatives to responding to data asymmetry or these kinds of situations when being asked to produce work product?
Sure. So discuss with the engagement leader. Sometimes your firm may have a policy on how to address these types of situations. If you are the engagement leader, you may need to take additional steps. The engagement letter is extremely important, as I said, and you may be able to set forth what action you will take in the engagement letter if certain data is not reasonably produced that can help you formulate your calculation or conclusion of value. In a lot of the ethics cases, we see analysts use hypothetical or limiting conditions as kind of a catch-all for situations where maybe they probably shouldn't have opined on something, but they did, but then they put a hypothetical condition. So be careful about couching something in a limiting condition or a hypothetical, because that can also get you in trouble unless it's very well executed and based on sound judgment. Another option is to not issue the calculation or conclusion of value until you get the data or some similar form of data that can be used in its place. And then as a last option, withdrawal from the engagement. But again, I have seen it handled different ways based on the formulation of the engagement letter.
Yeah, so back to the engagement letter. I know that Kerrie mentioned the importance in the business interruptions. They talked, and the judges were always talking about the engagement letter. Great. So what are some resources? Let's say, and this may not be one of the things that you've intended to discuss today, but what about resources for these types of issues, as well as maybe crafting a good engagement letter?
Sure. So one of the resources I've really keyed in on as EOB chair is this practice support forum. And this NACVA resource will actually help you address questions that are across the board in your professional practice. It can help you get answers from industry experts and kind of get a consensus on, say, the people on this AVW call, how they might approach it. There's also an NACVA mentorship program which exists, and Chinda has more information on that. And then we're trying to develop more NACVA CPE and webinars to help address these ethics adjacent issues that may arise, to help give our members more insight into how to address particular situations.
That's great. I know also the standards board has continually is updating and issuing resources like engagement letter templates and things like that. And so if they're not there, keep checking back, because those are things that are constantly being published for our membership's use.
There was a question, what's the difference between practice support form and membership program? The practice support form is actually a website that you can log into and submit questions. And the mentorship program is something where you're paired with an individual and it's more one-on-one. And there may be HQ sometimes will work with you for whether that person receives a fee for that mentorship service or not.
Great. Well, any last thoughts that you have for our membership? I know we're talking about doing some more of these segments from the Ethics Oversight Board, so I look forward to it. Any last thoughts that you want to leave with our attendees?
Just want to thank everybody for jumping on today. And this was couched as a building your brand segment, but really it's a building your brand for the Ethics Oversight Board. That's how I'm plugging this.
Which is there to serve our membership, right? To help us develop our practice and our professional services, right?
Yes. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Stephen.
Well, in an environment where we have people that can be acting as hired guns and advocates, this could position you in it with distinction out in the marketplace. So I think that it is hugely valuable to be able to lean in on how we show up, how we present our stuff, what we do, and bring that all full circle. So I can make the connection, Stephen and Janae.
Great.
Thank you.
But then again, my wife says I can spin anything. That comes from being a witness. I don't know.
I think it's just you, Mel.
Thank you guys for this presentation and everything. And that actually concludes our final polling question is up right now. Make sure that you answer it if you want CPE credits. And that leads us to the conclusion. Our next program is going to be February 10th at the same time. If you want to make sure that you get credit for it and registered for it, go ahead and use the email that you see listed here. If you want to be a possible guest on an AVW, make sure you email Chinda. We'll get you the proper information and we will look at it from there. And until then, You guys have an incredible first month of 2025. And I know in California it has turned out to be eventful so far. So, and stay safe out there, and we'll see you in February